Imagine mourning a fallen soldier, only to have a racist cop ruin the funeral with his gun drawn. General Nathaniel Carter, a four-star military leader, stood at the gravesite of his brother in arms, paying his last respects. But Sergeant Harper didn't see a decorated war hero. He saw a black man and deemed him a threat. With his gun aimed at the wrong man, Harper had no idea who he was dealing with, and when the truth came out, his career and his life was over. The wind howled through Arlington National Cemetery, a bitter reminder of the weight of grief that hung over the solemn gathering. The overcast sky cast a gray shadow over the rows of uniformed soldiers standing in perfect formation, their faces grim, their medals reflecting the dim light. The sound of boots shifting on the damp earth was barely audible over the hushed murmurs of mourners. A widow stood at the front, her face streaked with silent tears, her trembling fingers clenching a neatly folded American flag, the last tangible piece of the man she had lost. The pain in her eyes was the same pain shared by every soldier present. At the head of the ceremony, standing tall and unshaken, was General Nathaniel Carter, a four-star general, a combat veteran, a man who had commanded thousands on the battlefield. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable behind dark aviators, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. Today, however, he was not here as a commander. Today, he was here as a mourner. The man being laid to rest, Major William Daniels, had been more than just a soldier. He had been Carter's brother in arms, a friend, a man he had mentored from the time he was a young recruit to the moment he became a decorated officer. And now, he was gone, killed in a foreign desert by an IED. The ceremony had reached its final moments. The 21-gun salute had echoed through the hills. The haunting notes of taps had just faded into the wind. All that remained was one final farewell. General Carter took a deep breath, steeling himself. He stepped forward, ready to honor the man he had fought beside. Then it happened. A sudden shout cut through the quiet. "Get down! Hands where I can see them!" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads snapped toward the commotion. Two uniformed police officers had stepped forward, their presence stark against the sea of military uniforms. Their guns were drawn. Carter froze. Sergeant Doug Harper, a burly, middle-aged white officer, had his weapon aimed directly at Carter's chest. His stance was rigid, his scowl deep, his grip on his gun tight. Beside him stood Officer Bradley, younger, clearly uncertain. His hands trembled near his holster, his blue eyes darting between Harper and the stunned funeral attendees. The mourners stood in disbelief, the sacred ceremony now twisted into a scene of hostility. Major Daniel's widow let out a horrified sob. The uniformed soldiers, men and women who had served under Carter's leadership, stiffened instinctively, but they were unarmed. Their hands twitched at their sides, reaching for weapons that weren't there. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a funeral. Yet here they were, watching as one of their most decorated leaders, a four-star general, was being treated like a suspect. Carter's heartbeat was steady, his breathing controlled. He had faced enemy fire, led troops into battle, survived war zones, and yet, standing here, in his own country, in a place of honor and mourning, he was being threatened because of the color of his skin. Carter's voice cut through the tension, low and dangerous. "What do you think you're doing?" Sergeant Harper's grip tightened on his weapon. "I said, hands up," he barked, his voice sharp with unchecked authority. The moment hung thick in the air, pressing down on every soul in attendance. No one moved. No one breathed. Carter didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands. He had given orders to men in war, had faced death, had fought for the very freedom these officers were supposed to uphold. And now, that very freedom was being weaponized against him. Sergeant Harper had no idea who he was dealing with, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. A heavy silence fell over Arlington National Cemetery, smothering the gathering in stunned disbelief. The honor guards stood frozen beside the flag-draped casket, their pristine uniforms stiff against the cold wind. Rows of decorated officers and mourning soldiers locked eyes in horror. A four-star general, a man who had led thousands into battle, a national hero, and he was standing at gunpoint. Sergeant Doug Harper didn't waver. his gun still trained on General Nathaniel Carter. His grip was tight, his knuckles white, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. The man in front of him was motionless, his expression unreadable behind dark aviators. But Carter wasn't just standing still. He was studying him. Harper's arrogance, his ignorance, his unshakable belief that he had power over this moment. Carter saw all of it, and he knew how this would end before Harper even realized his mistake. Officer Bradley, Harper's younger partner, shifted uncomfortably. His wide blue eyes darted between Harper's gun and the growing crowd of stunned soldiers, outraged officers, and grieving families. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was an outright insult. The mourners whispered, their disbelief growing with each passing second. Major Daniel's widow clutched the folded flag, her breath shaky, her tears forgotten, as she stared at the nightmare unfolding before her. No one moved. No one dared. Carter didn't raise his hands. He didn't flinch. He just stared. His voice, when it came, was low, deliberate, and steady as iron. "You're making a mistake." Harper scoffed, his jaw tightening. He took another step forward, the barrel of his weapon tilted slightly higher. A threat. "Yeah? And what mistake is that?" Carter tilted his head just slightly, his words barely louder than a whisper. "You have no idea who I am." The murmurs among the soldiers grew louder. They knew. The officers knew. The mourners knew. But Harper? Harper still didn't get it. A slow smirk crept onto Harper's face. The kind of smirk that dripped with unchecked confidence. "I don't care who you are," he sneered. "You look suspicious, standing too close to the casket, whispering something." The funeral had just become a crime scene, and Harper had just desecrated it. A stillness spread through Carter's face. Not anger, not fear. Just something cold, something final. Then, with perfect control, he spoke. "I was praying." Silence. The wind picked up. The distant rustle of leaves filled the void Harper had created. Major Daniel's widow let out a choked gasp. Bradley tensed, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. The soldiers stiffened. Harper's smirk faltered, but he wasn't backing down. His disgust twisted into frustration, his rage outweighing his logic. He took another aggressive step forward, his gun almost shoving against Carter's chest. "I said get on the ground!" Carter's lips barely moved. "No, Sergeant. I won't." The world held its breath. The honor guard tightened their stances. The younger officer, Bradley, swallowed hard. This was not what he had signed up for. The widow's fingers dug into the folded flag, her silent grief replaced with silent terror. One wrong move, one panicked breath, one twitch of Harper's finger, and an innocent man would be shot. But Carter wasn't the one in danger. Harper was. Because Carter was no longer the one being controlled. He was the one controlling everything. And Harper was about to learn the hard way. The cemetery was frozen in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. All eyes were locked on Sergeant Doug Harper, his gun still trained on General Nathaniel Carter, a 4-star general, a combat veteran, a man who had led thousands into battle. And Harper was treating him like a criminal. Carter didn't blink, didn't flinch. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable behind his aviators. The wind howled through the cemetery, carrying whispers through the crowd of soldiers and mourners. Does he not know who that is? That's General Nathaniel Carter. Jesus, he's pointing a gun at a 4-star general. A few of the uniformed officers stiffened, their hands itching for their sidearms, except none of them were armed for the funeral. They could only watch. And Harper had no idea what was coming. His trigger finger twitched, his face twisted in arrogance, waiting for Carter to make one wrong move, one excuse to pull the trigger. But Carter wasn't giving him one. Then, Carter finally spoke. His voice was even, unshaken, but dangerously quiet. "Sergeant Harper, do you know who you just drew your weapon on?" Harper snorted, shaking his head. His grip on his gun remained tight, his chest puffed out like a man who still believed he was in charge. "Doesn't matter. Harper said flatly. The law is the law. And that was his final mistake. A sharp click of boots echoed through the cemetery. Colonel Sarah Davis stepped forward, her stern face set like stone, her uniform adorned with decorations that spoke of years in battle. When she spoke, her tone was ice-cold, unshaken, lethal. Sergeant Harper, lower your weapon. Now. Harper whipped around, confusion flickering across his features. Excuse me? Davis didn't blink. She simply lifted one gloved hand and pointed to the 4 silver stars gleaming on Carter's shoulders. Harper's face drained of color. Reality crashed down on him like a landslide. This wasn't just some civilian. This wasn't just some soldier. This was General Nathaniel Carter, one of the highest-ranking military officials in the entire country. And Harper had just held him at gunpoint. It was over. But Carter wasn't done. Carter took a slow step forward, and for the first time, Harper stepped back. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the power shift so stark it felt like the earth itself had tilted. Carter's voice was a quiet command, the kind that ended careers. Tell me, Sergeant, Carter said smoothly. What exactly did you think I was doing? Harper's throat bobbed. He opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed hard. He had no answer. Carter took another step forward. The man who had survived wars, led men into battle, and commanded thousands now loomed over Harper like a judge delivering a verdict. You saw my face, my skin, and you decided I was a threat. The truth landed like a bomb. Harper was trapped. The entire funeral crowd was watching his downfall unfold in real time. The soldiers, the officers, the grieving widow. Every single witness knew exactly what this was. Officer Bradley, still standing beside Harper, looked horrified. His hands clenched at his sides, his face pale. He took a slow step away from Harper. Even he didn't want to be associated with this. And then, Carter delivered the final blow. Sergeant Harper, Carter said, his voice low, firm, deadly serious. You are a disgrace to that badge. A ripple of agreement moved through the soldiers. The funeral mourners murmured, nodding to themselves. Harper's hands trembled. The power he thought he had, gone. The respect he assumed was his by default, destroyed. And then Carter took one final step forward. Now, lower your weapon. The command hit like a hammer. Harper hesitated. His hands shook. His authority had been stripped away in an instant. And then, finally, he lowered the gun. But it was already too late. His career was over. His reputation was shattered, and he just didn't know it yet. A heavy silence fell over Arlington National Cemetery. The air was thick with tension, with judgment, with finality. Sergeant Doug Harper's hands shook as he slowly lowered his weapon. His face was a mix of shock, anger, and humiliation, but mostly fear. The realization had finally hit him. He had pointed his gun at a 4-star general, in front of high-ranking officers, in the middle of a military funeral. His career was over. His life was ruined. And there was no way out. Colonel Davis didn't hesitate. She turned sharply to the 2 military police officers standing nearby. Military police, take him into custody. The words struck like a hammer. Harper's entire body went rigid. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The 2 MPs moved in instantly, their faces calm, efficient, and unreadable. Harper stumbled back, his breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Wait, what? Harper's voice cracked, a mix of confusion and sheer terror. Officer Bradley stood frozen, his expression a mix of shock and silent understanding. The soldiers remained stone-faced, their eyes locked onto Harper with cold judgment. General Carter hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. Harper was already done. The MPs grabbed Harper's arms, strong, firm, unyielding. Hands behind your back. The command was final. Harper jerked, trying to resist. His instinct was to fight back, to push away, to reclaim the power he thought he had. Click. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. It was over. Harper's face contorted in disbelief, his head whipping around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. This is a mistake. I was doing my job, Harper shouted, his voice breaking. Colonel Davis didn't flinch. Her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes sharp with disdain. Your job? She repeated coldly. Your job is to serve and protect, not to profile and humiliate. Harper's face turned red, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He thrashed, but the MPs held him tight. This isn't happening. You can't do this, he barked, his voice frantic, desperate. Officer Bradley took a single step back, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists, but not out of support. It was disgust. I saw everything, Sergeant. Bradley's voice was low, disappointed, final. Harper froze. His face twisted into something pathetic, something weak. He had lost everything. Desperate, he turned to the one man he had disrespected the most, Carter. General, please. You know I didn't mean… Carter raised a single hand. Harper shut up instantly. The funeral crowd watched in utter silence, eyes bouncing between Carter and the disgraced officer in cuffs. Carter's voice was quiet, but lethal. Now you want to talk? Harper's breath hitched, his body trembling. Sir, Carter stepped forward. His dark aviators shielded his eyes, but his voice cut through the cold air like a blade. When you pointed that gun at me, you weren't interested in talking. Silence. Deafening silence. Harper breathed heavily, his chest rising and falling in panicked bursts. For the first time, he truly understood. He was finished. The MPs yanked him forward, his feet stumbling over the damp grass. The long, humiliating walk to the patrol car had begun. And then, the final humiliation. The soldiers watched him go. The officers didn't say a word. The mourners, every single one of them, stared at him with blank, judgmental eyes. No one defended him. No one felt sorry for him. The widow of Major Daniels stood near the casket, still clutching the folded flag to her chest. Her eyes followed Harper's pathetic, broken figure. And then she simply shook her head. Harper looked back one last time. His face was pale. He was truly alone. The MPs shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The door slammed shut. That sound was the final nail in his coffin. Doug Harper, the man who thought his badge made him untouchable, was now the one in cuffs. Carter didn't even look at him anymore. He had nothing left to say. Instead, he turned his back to Harper and faced the honor guard. Resume the honors, he ordered. Justice had been served. But Carter knew this wasn't over yet. The bugler stepped forward, lifting his instrument. And then, the first note of taps filled the air. Taps. A solemn, final farewell. From the back seat of the patrol car, Harper closed his eyes, his disgrace complete. The courtroom was packed. This was the trial of the year. The fall of Sergeant Doug Harper. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashing, pens scribbling notes. Military officials sat in the audience, officers, generals, even members of Congress. Civilians gathered, their faces tense, eager to see if justice would truly be served. And at the center of it all, Harper. He sat at the defense table, his hands cuffed, his uniform stripped of rank. His once arrogant demeanor was gone. He looked hollow, his skin pale, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. This wasn't the same man who had barked orders at a four-star general. This was a man facing the end of his life as he knew it. Across the room, General Nathaniel Carter sat in the front row. His arms were folded, his posture commanding even in silence. His expression unreadable, but his presence alone made Harper shift uncomfortably. Then, the judge entered. The room stood. Harper swallowed hard, because the judge was black. The reality of the situation was finally settling in. Harper wasn't in control anymore. He never had been. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the case with brutal efficiency. First, the video footage. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the screen displayed the funeral scene. Harper, gun drawn, barking orders at a four-star general for no reason. The shock, the fear. The moment he realized his mistake, too late. Next, Witness testimony. Soldiers, officers, and even Officer Bradley took the stand, each one confirming Harper's blatant abuse of power. Bradley, once his partner, looked disgusted as he testified. He targeted General Carter because he was black. That's the truth. And then, Harper's past comes back to haunt him. Complaints from previous black and Hispanic civilians. Harassment allegations swept under the rug for years. A pattern of racist misconduct ignored until now. The judge's expression remained cold, unreadable. Harper squirmed. The walls were closing in. His lawyer tried to fight back. Desperate. Weak. Your Honor, my client was simply following protocol. The judge interrupted. Cold. Sharp. Final. Protocol? Pointing a gun at a 4-star general? Harper shrank in his seat. His lawyer sat down. He had no defense. Then, General Carter stood. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. He walked to the witness stand, his steps slow, deliberate. He took his seat, adjusted his uniform, and turned to face Harper. Harper refused to meet his gaze. Then, Carter spoke. I have fought in wars. I have commanded troops. I have buried my brothers in arms. But never, never did I expect to be treated as a threat at a funeral. Harper shifted in his seat, his breath shallow. Sergeant Harper didn't see a soldier, Carter continued, his voice calm but edged with steel. He saw a black man, and that was enough for him. The judge exhaled slowly. The jury exchanged looks. Everyone knew. Harper was finished. The jury took only 30 minutes to deliberate. Harper knew what was coming, but he still held on to a sliver of hope. The judge leaned forward. His voice was calm, but final. Sergeant Doug Harper, you are sentenced to life in prison. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to take notes. The room buzzed. Harper's face turned white as a sheet. His breath hitched. His body trembled. He gripped the table like it would somehow save him. His world had just collapsed. Your Honor, please, Harper choked. This is too much. The judge didn't blink. You had a choice, Sergeant, and now you will live with it. The gavel slammed. Harper was yanked to his feet. His cuffs tightened. The officers grabbed his arms. His life was over. As he was dragged away, he made one last desperate attempt. General, please! I didn't mean… Carter didn't even turn his head. His words cut through the air like a blade. Justice has been served. And Harper was led away, disgraced, destroyed, and erased. Carter sat back, his posture calm, unshaken. This wasn't just a victory. This was the beginning of real change. The moment Harper loses everything. The courtroom doors swing open, reporters rush forward, cameras flashing, microphones extended. Harper is dragged out in cuffs, his face pale, his expression hollow. For years, he had carried himself with arrogance, with authority. But now, he was just another criminal. The headlines explode. By the time Harper is shoved into the transport van, the world already knows. The media storm is relentless. News outlets, social media, even international press cover the case. Breaking news. Racist cop sentenced to life for pulling gun on 4-star general. White officer who profiled black military leader gets maximum punishment. Justice served. Funeral gunpoint incident ends in life sentence. The footage from the trial plays on a loop. Harper, head bowed, wrists in cuffs. His mugshot floods the internet. His disgrace is no longer a private matter. It's global. The internet doesn't hold back. Imagine pulling a gun on a 4-star general. Harper just set a new world record for dumbest cop alive. Harper went from badge to inmate real quick. The only uniform he's wearing now is an orange jumpsuit. Memes flood Twitter and Reddit. Videos of the trial rack up millions of views. Even late-night comedians tear into Harper. And then, former victims come forward. A black veteran posts a video recounting how Harper harassed him years ago. A Latino man shares dashcam footage of Harper illegally searching his car. More and more victims speak up. each one adding to the growing pile of lawsuits against him. Harper's reputation is beyond repair. He is toxic. He is done. Meanwhile, General Carter stays silent. The media begs him for interviews, but he refuses. He has no interest in public spectacle. His only focus is honoring Major Daniels. The military holds a private memorial for Daniels. No interruptions, no racism, just respect. Carter stands at attention, watching the flag being folded, knowing that justice, real justice, has been served. But Harper's nightmare isn't over, because now he has to survive prison, and that is a whole new battle he isn't ready for. The doors slam shut. Harper is no longer in control. The heavy steel prison doors lock behind him, sealing his fate. The sound echoes through the corridor, a final chilling reminder that his power is gone. Guards march him forward, his hands cuffed, his face blank. But the inmates are watching. A row of prisoners lean against the bars, their eyes locked onto Harper. Some smirk, others whisper. One tattooed man nudges his friend. "Yo, ain't that the cop from the news?" Another inmate grins. "Oh yeah. The one who pulled a gun on a general?" Harper keeps his head down. But he hears everything. Reality hits hard. For years, Harper walked with arrogance, flashing his badge, using his authority like a weapon. Now, he's just another inmate. Powerless. Vulnerable. A marked man. The guards don't care. To them, he's just another criminal. He clutches his prison-issued uniform, his knuckles white. Day 1. In prison. The shift in power. The cafeteria is loud, until Harper walks in. Instant silence. Every inmate turns. They know who he is. A group of black prisoners exchange looks. One smirks. "Well, well, well, Mr. Authority." Harper grips his tray, his hands trembling. He finds an empty seat. Alone. Even the ex-cops in prison refuse to sit with him. He is truly alone. He stares down at his food, pushing it around with his fork. He used to walk into restaurants and expect respect. Now, he's nothing. Night 1. The real nightmare begins. His cellmate steps inside, a broad-shouldered man covered in scars. He grins. "Well, well, look who it is." Harper frowns. "Do I know you?" The man chuckles, cracking his knuckles. "You should. You arrested me 10 years ago." Harper's blood runs cold. The cell door locks. No guards. No backup. No gun. Harper backs against the wall, his heart pounding. He had spent his career humiliating people like his cellmate. Now, he's the one at their mercy. Karma has arrived. And it's not merciful. Meanwhile, miles away, General Carter sits at home, watching the news. He sees Harper's mugshot, the trial footage, the prison footage. But Carter doesn't smile. He doesn't celebrate. Because this was never about revenge. It was about justice. Harper wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symbol of everything wrong with a broken system. And now, that system had finally held him accountable. Carter turns off the TV. He has work to do, because the fight isn't over. There are still more Harpers out there. More officers abusing their power. And Carter? He won't stop until they all fall. But for Harper, his story is over. His power is gone. And now, for the first time in his life, he's facing true consequences.